5 men were shipwrecked on a deserted island, and within months, they had built something close to a tiny frontier settlement. A few dozen miles away, 19 other sailors were dying one by one from hunger and exposure. Same island, same year, same endless rain. Neither group knew the other existed, and the difference between their fates had begun before either crew ever stepped ashore. The place was Auckland Island, hundreds of miles south of New Zealand, deep in a part of the South Pacific where weather does not behave like background scenery. Wind can cross thousands of miles of open ocean without a continent getting in the way, then hit the island with almost nothing left to slow it down. Rain falls so often that dry clothing becomes less a condition than a temporary accident. The ground stays soaked, the slopes turn slick, and the southern rata trees grow bent and twisted instead of providing the kind of long, straight lumber any builder would want. Remember those boards. A surprising amount of this story comes down to boards. The first ship was the Grafton, a small wooden schooner that would have looked modest beside almost any serious ocean-going vessel. She sailed from Sydney on a commercial expedition led in part by a Frenchman named François Édouard, who had heard reports of tin ore mixed with silver on Campbell Island. Raynal had already spent years chasing gold in Australia, survived a mine collapse, endured serious illness, and even gone temporarily blind. When somebody offered him another uncertain way to make money at the edge of the map, apparently the sensible part of his brain had already learned to keep quiet. The captain was Thomas Musgrave, still relatively young but already deeply experienced at sea. One official historical study later described him as British by birth and American by nationality at the time of the voyage, although other accounts simply call him English. With him were the Norwegian sailor Alexander McLaren, known as Alec, the young Englishman George Harris, and the Portuguese cook Henri Forge. 5 men in all, which sounds like a tiny crew until you discover that a tiny group can sometimes solve problems a larger one cannot. The mining venture failed. The valuable ore they expected to find did not appear in useful quantities, and sealing offered little chance of recovering the money already spent. The trip had become the 19th century version of a business venture where everybody keeps saying the opportunity is still promising because nobody wants to admit the money is gone. They started back towards Sydney and decided to stop around the Auckland Islands in the hope of finding enough seals to make the failure slightly less expensive. In the first days of January, bad weather finished the argument. The anchor chain failed and the Grafton began drifting toward the rocks inside Carnley Harbor. Waves lifted the schooner and slammed her down again until timber cracked, the keel failed, and water entered the hull. The voyage was over. Yet the most important thing the Grafton did that night was something a wrecked ship normally fails to do. She stayed there. The schooner did not disappear into deep water. She remained stranded close enough to shore inside a relatively protected harbor for the crew to keep reaching her. Alec entered the freezing water carrying a line, reached land, and secured it to a tree. The others followed. They were now stranded on an island hundreds of miles from help, but behind them lay something enormously valuable. Not a working ship anymore, but almost an entire hardware store. The Grafton contained boards already cut by professional shipwrights, iron fittings, nails, rope, sailcloth, containers, tools, cookware, firearms, books, clothing, and a small boat. In Sydney, most of those things were ordinary. On Auckland Island, each represented hours, days, or even months of labor that the 5 men no longer had to perform. An island tree is useful, but an island tree is not a straight board. Iron may exist somewhere in rock, but 5 stranded sailors are not going to open a mine, build a smelter, and reinvent metallurgy before supper. A wrecked 19th century ship contained stored human labor. Lumbermen had cut the trees. Shipwrights had shaped the boards. Blacksmiths had worked the iron. Rope makers had twisted the lines and sail makers had woven and sewn the canvas. When the Grafton broke against the rocks, all of that work from another world suddenly became available to 5 men who desperately needed it. They also recovered food. Accounts mention roughly 100 pounds of ship biscuit, about half that amount of flour, along with tea, coffee, pork, and tobacco. Some supplies had originally belonged personally to Raynal and Musgrave, but once they were ashore, the men treated the provisions as common property. That decision looks small until you compare it with what happened elsewhere on the island. 5 men sharing a shrinking food supply can make a plan. 5 men protecting individual piles of food begin a completely different experiment. Their first serious project was shelter. They did not build a little branch lean-to good enough for a dramatic photograph. They salvaged wood from the Grafton and built a real house with walls, sleeping places, a stone fireplace, and a chimney. They made mortar by burning shells to produce lime. Light came from lamps fueled with seal oil, and the structure became solid enough to serve not merely as shelter, but as the center of their entire life. They gave the house a name, Epigwaitt. Musgrave later claimed the word came from a North American indigenous term meaning something like a home by the waves, although the exact linguistic origin has never been established clearly. Whatever the name meant, the place became their tiny town hall, bedroom, school, and workshop. Outside there was mud, rain, and wind. Inside there were beds, fire, and a routine. The men cut so much firewood over time that the land around Epigwaitt was visibly altered. More than a century later, archaeological work found physical traces matching important parts of the accounts left by Musgrave and Raynal. Evidence of construction remained. Evidence of metalworking remained. The men had not simply written an impressive survival story after returning home. They had changed the ground enough for later investigators to see it. Then the 5 did something that makes the whole story feel less like Robinson Crusoe and more like a political experiment. They established rules for governing themselves. On board the Grafton, Musgrave had been captain because maritime law, the owners, and the entire structure of shipboard life said he was captain. On the island, that structure had disappeared, so the men decided that important matters would be settled by majority vote and that all 5 would be treated as equals in common decisions. Musgrave was elected leader. That distinction matters. He did not remain captain simply because everybody was too polite to tell him the ship no longer existed. 4 men actively accepted his authority again, and in principle, they could withdraw it. The rules were written on a page of Musgrave's Bible and reread every Sunday, which produces one of the strangest images in the entire story. 5 stranded men sitting in a handmade house while wind hammered the island outside, reviewing the constitution of a country with a population smaller than a family dinner. Then they opened a school. Alec had limited literacy, and instead of deciding that reading was rather low on the survival list, the others began teaching him. Evenings were used for reading, writing, arithmetic, languages, and mechanical knowledge. When ordinary ink ran out, they improvised with seal blood. They also made cards and simple games, because apparently being shipwrecked did not exempt anybody from homework or losing at cards after dinner. The school mattered for reasons that had little to do with spelling. It prevented life from shrinking completely into calories and weather. One man could still be a teacher. Another could still be a student. Tomorrow could contain something other than another hunt, another wet shirt, and another pile of firewood. They were not merely preserving bodies. They were preserving roles. Raynal became the settlement's technical engine, using metal recovered from the wreck, stone from the island, and bellows improvised partly from sealskin. He built a working forge. That single achievement changed the nature of their situation because tools were no longer a finite inheritance from the ship. A damaged piece of metal could be repaired or reshaped. A missing item could sometimes be manufactured instead of mourned. Raynal also made soap from animal fat and alkaline material. When the men's original footwear wore out, hides were processed and turned into replacements. They hunted seals and sea lions when available, caught fish, collected shellfish, and killed seabirds. Water was the one resource Auckland Island delivered with almost comic generosity. Nobody had to ration rain. The original food from the Grafton gradually disappeared. Accounts suggest that at one point almost nothing remained from the original stores except a few pounds of flour and some mustard. That detail destroys the easy idea that these men survived because they sat beside a wreck packed with food for a year and a half. The food ran out. What continued helping them was the ship's technology. Tools kept producing value long after the biscuits were gone. The 5 men were not a colony of saints. They became angry with one another, argued over small things, and sometimes needed distance. Raynal understood that resentment inside such a tiny group was dangerous because nobody could simply leave. There was no hotel, no neighboring town, and no spare apartment across town. If somebody irritated you badly enough, the only available change of scenery was another wet part of the same island. Still, the system held. Work had a schedule, food had rules, evenings had lessons, leadership had consent. Conflict existed, but it had not yet become more powerful than cooperation. Almost everything about that balance would look different on the other side of the island. A few months after the Grafton disaster, the Invercauld approached the northwestern coast. It was a very different ship, a large 3-masted vessel of almost 900 tons, built in Scotland and only months old. Beside the little Grafton, it would have looked enormous. More ship should have meant more safety, more supplies, and more chances. Instead, the larger ship left its survivors with less. In May, the Invercauld struck the exposed coast of Auckland Island beneath enormous cliffs. This was not a protected harbor where a broken hull could rest on rocks and become a warehouse. Ocean swells hit the vessel directly, and the ship began breaking apart almost immediately. There was no careful unloading, no repeated trip back for timber, no organized salvage operation. Men threw off heavy boots and waterproof clothing because those same items could drag them under once they were in the sea. 25 men entered the water. 6 died before reaching land. 19 made it ashore, nearly 4 times the number of men who had survived the Grafton wreck. Yet those 19 arrived with little usable equipment, very little food, and in some cases, almost no useful footwear. Behind them, the ship was disappearing. In front of them rose cliffs that in places approached the height of a 30-story building. And the calendar had changed. The Grafton wrecked in January, during southern summer. The Invercauld wrecked in May, as winter was arriving. That difference sounds minor when printed on a calendar. On a sub-Antarctic island, it changes the entire economy of survival. Summer brought more animals near shore, more birds, longer days, and relatively less brutal temperatures. The 5 men had months to learn their environment and improve their shelter before the worst weather arrived. The Invercauld survivors reached land while the island was shutting down. Daylight was shrinking, the cold was increasing, and animals were becoming harder to find. Wet clothing stayed wet. Every movement consumed calories the body also needed simply to maintain temperature. The first group entered the natural grocery store when the doors opened. The second arrived while somebody was turning off the lights. Even their matches nearly disappeared through pure human error. The cook attempted to dry one box too close to the fire and ruined it. Another officer began doing almost the same thing with the second supply until a young sailor named Robert Holding intervened. Fire survived. Almost everything else became more difficult. The men built a cramped shelter from whatever material they could gather. 19 people tried to crowd beneath a space barely adequate for a small family. According to Holding's much later account, Captain George Dalgarno had been psychologically crushed by the disaster and provided little effective leadership during the crucial early period. Holding also remembered some officers continuing to expect junior crewmen to bring water and gather food for them, as though the old shipboard order still existed. That is one of the sharpest contrasts between the two camps. On the Grafton, the ship disappeared as an institution, and the men deliberately replaced its hierarchy with a new system. On the Invercauld, according to Holding, parts of the old hierarchy remained after the physical structure supporting it had vanished. The deck was gone. The cabins were gone. The shipping company might as well have been on another planet. Yet rank was still trying to collect room service. It would be convenient to declare that this alone explains everything. It does not. Voting is easier when you have shelter, tools, food, and a whole wooden ship to dismantle. Good management becomes rather more difficult when everybody is barefoot, cold, and hungry under a wet cliff. Leadership mattered, but leadership was operating inside completely different physical conditions. The Invercauld survivors began to fragment. Food was hidden, smaller alliances formed. Common work became harder to organize. Holding, who was only in his early 20s, concluded that waiting for somebody else to solve the problem was dangerous. He searched for shellfish, caught birds, climbed difficult ground, and worked to maintain the fire. He also wanted the group to move. There had to be places with more food and better chances of being spotted from the sea. According to his account, senior officers rejected the idea. Men began dying while the group remained in poor conditions, and the social world of the survivors became smaller at almost exactly the same rate as their food supply. Hunger has a way of reducing the size of the universe. At first, a stranded man thinks about home. Later, he thinks about rescue. Then, about next week. Eventually, the entire world can become a single, wet rock with a shellfish underneath it. Holding later wrote that the survivors eventually discussed drawing lots to determine whether one person should die so the others could eat. He refused to participate, then realized that refusing to take part did not necessarily protect him from being selected by somebody else. He began spending more time apart from the group. He also described a darker episode involving a nighttime fight. One man was forced out of the shelter and was found dead the following morning. Days later, Holding believed that part of the body had been eaten. There's no need to turn the episode into spectacle. What matters is that his memoir describes a group that had crossed from hunger into a completely different psychological world. There is also a problem with treating every detail as unquestionable fact. Holding wrote his detailed memoir roughly 60 years after the wreck, when he was already an old man. Another account, produced much closer to the events, paints some aspects of the officers less harshly. That does not mean Holding invented his story, but memory is not a security camera. Give it 6 decades, and even an argument over a backyard fence can become the Battle of Gettysburg. So Dalgarno does not need to become the perfect villain, and Holding does not need to become the perfect hero. A captain can collapse under pressure. A young sailor can see a better course of action. A memory can also sharpen old resentments. All of those things can exist in the same history. There is another detail that makes the comparison more complicated. The Invercauld survivors did not remain empty-handed for an entire year. After weeks of suffering and mounting deaths, members of the group eventually reached the abandoned settlement of Hardwick around Port Ross. Buildings remained there, along with limited tools, metal containers, and other scraps of infrastructure. That sounds like the moment everything should have improved. The problem was timing. By then, the group had already suffered enormously. Men were weak, numbers had fallen, and the social organization had been damaged. A roof discovered on the first freezing night can save a man. The same roof, found weeks later, cannot bring him back. This is one of the most important corrections to the simple version of the story. It is not accurate to say that the Grafton men received everything and the Invercauld men received absolutely nothing. The second group eventually found useful human infrastructure. They found it late, after the most dangerous period had already done much of its work. At one point, roughly 10 men were still alive. Later, only 4 remained. When Second Officer James Mahoney died, 3 men were left: Captain Dalgarno, the first mate, and Robert Holding. Then something interesting happened. 3 men began functioning better than 19 had. They used what remained around Port Ross, improvised a canoe from a framework of branches covered with sealskins, crossed to nearby islands, and reached places where rabbits could be hunted. They fished, moved, and organized themselves. They had not suddenly developed superior character. The social problem had become smaller. 3 hungry men can argue around the same fire until a decision is made. 19 hungry men already have a legislature. In May of the following year, a vessel named Julian entered the harbor. Nobody aboard was searching for survivors. The ship had developed a leak, and a boat went ashore looking for material that might help with repairs. Instead, the sailors found 3 men who had survived for more than a year. 16 of the 19 who had reached shore from the Invercauld were dead. For Holding, the strange part came after rescue. Once he stepped aboard a functioning ship, the hierarchy that had seemed so useless on the island returned almost instantly. The captain and first mate were again treated as officers. Holding went below. According to his later memoir, he was discouraged from talking too freely about the part he believed he had played in keeping the group alive. When they reached South America, the officers were able to continue their journey more easily. Holding was largely left to fend for himself and eventually had to find work and another ship. On Auckland Island, rank had nearly evaporated. The moment there was a deck beneath their feet again, it returned. Meanwhile, the 5 Grafton men had no idea any of this was happening. Musgrave sometimes climbed to high ground to study the horizon and sketch the coast. On one occasion, he saw smoke in the distance. He did not investigate. From a warm room more than a century later, that decision sounds almost insane. On Auckland Island, it looked different. The terrain between camps was wet, steep, tangled, and difficult enough to turn a short distance on a map into days of exhausting travel. Smoke could have several explanations, and leaving the established camp carried its own risk. Musgrave stayed where he was. Later writers suggested that the smoke might have come from the Invercauld survivors. If that was true, the 2 groups had come close enough to see the simplest signal one human being can send another: smoke. And they still never met. As the months passed, the Grafton settlement developed another problem. Nobody came to rescue them. Musgrave's confidence eventually began to crack. At one particularly low point, he considered taking a very small boat to sea alone, even though the attempt could easily have become suicide. Raynal talked him out of it. That moment matters because it ruins the cartoon version of Musgrave as the unbreakable leader who always knew exactly what to do. He broke too. The difference was that he broke inside a functioning group that could pull him back. A leader does not have to be indestructible if somebody is still there when he is not. Eventually, the men decided that waiting had become more dangerous than trying to leave. Their first plan was ambitious. They would build a new vessel. Raynal used the forge to make tools, and preparations began, but the project eventually ran into an almost absurdly small technical obstacle. They could not produce the right kind of auger. Without a suitable boring tool, they could not build key parts of the new vessel properly. Months of ingenuity, courage, and practical knowledge ran straight into one missing piece of equipment. Survival stories usually prefer hurricanes, sharks, and dramatic injuries. Reality occasionally tries to kill the plot with the wrong drill bit. They abandoned the plan to build a completely new vessel and turned instead to the small boat salvaged from the Grafton. It was lengthened, its sides were raised, Decking was added and the structure strengthened. They named it Rescue. The forge now became central to the escape plan. The men needed hundreds of fasteners. Night after night they heated iron and hammered out nails, sometimes setting themselves a target of roughly 50 in an evening. Every one represented a few more inches of boat that might hold together once the island disappeared behind them. When normal marine caulking materials were unavailable, they improvised with what the island could provide, including lime and animal fat. Rescue did not have to win a boat show. It had one job: keep the ocean outside. In July, 3 men launched into open water. Ahead of them lay roughly 450 kilometers of Southern Ocean in a modified ship's boat built by castaways using homemade fasteners and improvised sealant. Calling it ambitious would be generous. Calling it completely unreasonable would also be fair. The ocean responded accordingly. Bad weather followed them for days. They dealt with waves, cold, exhaustion, and almost no chance of staying dry. Eventually, they saw Stewart Island and for a moment could finally look at solid land instead of a moving horizon. Then the wind nearly pushed them away again. Their strength was almost gone. After surviving well over a year on Auckland Island, they came close to losing everything within sight of safety. They managed to get ashore, where local people fed them, gave them clean clothes, and allowed them to wash. According to later accounts, they were so exhausted that they slept for roughly a full day. Musgrave then began trying to return for Harris and Forge, the 2 men still waiting on Auckland Island. Even this was not simple. Local authorities had limited money and could not immediately provide the rescue operation he wanted. Residents helped raise money through public subscription, and a cutter named Flying Scud was eventually arranged. Musgrave went back as guide. Poor weather slowed the voyage, a faulty compass created additional problems, and the rescue mission stretched into weeks. Meanwhile, Harris and Forge had discovered that a society of 5 and a society of 2 are not the same thing. Food had become increasingly difficult to obtain. They were catching and eating mice around Epigwaitt. The 2 men argued so badly that they considered separating and living in different parts of the island simply to avoid each other. This is perhaps the best antidote to the polished management seminar version of the Grafton story. The model community was cracking too. The rules had not turned 5 men into some superior branch of humanity. They were still tired, hungry people who had spent far too long trapped together. When rescue finally arrived, both men were alive. Later, each accepted some responsibility for the quarrel. All 5 members of the Grafton party survived, but the final 2 had moved much closer to social collapse than the neat version of the story usually admits. Civilization did not defeat the island. It lasted long enough. During later searching, another piece of the Invercauld story surfaced. Near the abandoned buildings at Port Ross, a dead man was found. Beside the body lay a piece of roofing slate with marks scratched into it. One readable part appeared to contain a name: James. The body was believed to be James Mahoney of the Invercauld. The 2 shipwreck stories had finally touched one another, but only after most of the people involved had already left the island or died there. The discovery created enough concern that Musgrave later returned aboard the Victoria as part of a wider search effort supported by colonial authorities. They looked for other possible survivors. None remained to be found. Now place the 2 groups beside each other and the obvious lesson practically writes itself. Grafton, 5 men. House, forge, school, written rules, working boat, and everyone survives. Invercauld, 19 men. Weak leadership, hidden food, internal conflict, 16 dead. Good leadership saved the first group. Bad leadership destroyed the second. Excellent story. Almost certainly incomplete. Start with inventory. The Grafton remained on the rocks, and and that gave its crew boards, iron, rope, canvas, containers, tools, weapons, books, and a small boat from the first days of the crisis. The Invercauld disappeared so quickly that most of the enormous ship became useless to the people who had just escaped from it. One group lost transportation, the other lost transportation and infrastructure. Those are not the same accident. Then look at geography. The Grafton wrecked inside Carnley Harbor, where the crew could approach the hull, work on shore, and access useful coastal resources. The Invercauld hit an exposed coast beneath enormous cliffs. One group was stranded beside a workshop. The other was stranded beside a wall. Then look at the calendar. January against May. Summer against the beginning of winter. Months of relatively better conditions against shrinking daylight and a collapsing food supply. 4 months look small on paper. On a sub-Antarctic island, they can be the difference between an animal standing on the beach and an empty beach. Then look at numbers. 5 men sound weaker than 19, and in many situations they would be. More people mean more muscle, more skills, and more eyes looking for food. They also mean more mouths, more status conflicts, more alliances, and more opportunities for somebody to hide breakfast. If 5 men kill a large animal, the animal can feed them well. If 19 starving men obtain the same amount of meat, now you have a distribution problem. And preservation, and trust, and politics. There is also the question of timing. The Grafton men received their technological advantage immediately. The Invercauld survivors found Hardwick only after the crucial early period had already damaged the group. Resources do not simply exist. They arrive at a moment. A match before the first freezing night and a match after 2 weeks are the same object. They are not the same value. This is where leadership becomes genuinely interesting instead of becoming a slogan. Musgrave adapted his authority. Raynal was unusually capable with his hands and mind. The 5 men created rules before resentment became dominant. Personal provisions were pooled. Education, work, and games created routine. Their society gave each man reasons to remain useful beyond simply eating. The Invercauld group handled many of those problems badly. Holding appears to have argued for movement earlier. The group delayed. Authority weakened. Food was hidden and labor was uneven. When their numbers became smaller and their location improved, their survival behavior also improved. So leadership mattered. Character mattered. Cooperation mattered. They simply did not operate alone. Put 2 carpenters in separate garages. Give the first one lumber, a workbench, screws, tools, electricity, and a dry roof. Give the second wet branches, no shoes, and a cold parking lot. Then ask them both to build a door. When one door looks better, you can praise the carpenter. Just remember who had the drill. That is what the Grafton really was. A toolbox, a lumber rack, a library, a stove, a supply of metal, a lifeboat. Hundreds or thousands of hours of labor performed by people who were safely back in civilization. The 5 men did not create civilization from nothing. They unpacked civilization from wreckage. The Invercauld men received much less of that stored work during the period when it mattered most. Their experience shows how quickly social habits become fragile when the physical system supporting those habits disappears. An officer's authority makes perfect sense on a ship with food below deck, bunks, schedules, tools, a galley, and a destination. Take away the ship, and the rank may remain in people's heads long after the machinery beneath it is gone. The Grafton group rebuilt the system. The Invercauld group tried to preserve parts of the old one while losing the physical world that had made it useful. There was also a distinctly American flavor to the Grafton half of the story. Musgrave had an American connection in historical records, and the whole experience resembles an extreme frontier narrative. 5 men reach the edge of nowhere, build a cabin, establish rules, open a school, start a forge, manufacture what they need, and eventually construct a way out. It sounds almost too perfect, which is why the mice matter. The arguments matter. Musgrave nearly giving up matters. The failed shipbuilding project matters. Reality refuses to stay inside a motivational poster. The Grafton community did not survive because it could never collapse. It survived because it did not collapse before the men created a route home. That is a much narrower claim. The Invercauld group experienced the reverse. Collapse began early, and recovery came late. When the survivors finally became a group of 3, they cooperated more effectively. They built a canoe, changed location, hunted rabbits, and fished. Those men were not incapable of solving problems. They had spent too long inside conditions where almost every problem made the next problem worse. The disasters on the sub-Antarctic islands eventually produced a remarkably practical government response. Authorities began establishing emergency depots for future shipwreck survivors. Food was stored, warm clothing and blankets were left behind. Matches, tools, fishing equipment, and compasses were supplied. In some places, boats were available, and signs directed castaways toward the depots. Animals, including rabbits, pigs, goats, and cattle, were also released in some areas, so that future survivors might have something to hunt. Authorities even worried about sailors from passing ships stealing emergency clothing, so distinctive garments could make stolen supplies inconvenient to wear later. After all the philosophy about leadership and human nature, government eventually arrived at a beautifully simple conclusion. Leave matches. Leave food. Leave dry clothes. Civilization becomes easier when your feet are warm. Raynal's account of the Grafton ordeal later reached Europe and became connected with the work of Jules Verne. Soon afterward, Verne published The Mysterious Island, a novel built around a remarkably familiar idea. A small group, isolated from normal society, uses technical knowledge, organization, and practical work to turn an island into a functioning home. The men manufacture, they build, they organize. Technology becomes survival. Verne even mentioned Raynal among real castaways. The real island had become part of the shadow behind a famous fictional one. Fiction, naturally, made everything cleaner. Reality had seal blood for ink. Reality had homemade soap. Reality had a captain considering an almost suicidal escape. Reality had a boat project defeated by one missing tool. Reality had 2 exhausted men catching mice and trying to figure out how far apart they could live without leaving the island. That mess is exactly what makes the real story better. Archaeological work at Epigwaitt later supported many of the physical details in Musgrave's and Raynal's accounts. The house and working areas had left traces. Metalworking had left traces. Human occupation had changed the landscape. The Invercauld side remains harder to reconstruct with the same confidence because some of its darkest details depend heavily on Holding's late memoir. His account dramatically changed the reputation of Dalgarno and the other officers. Holding appeared as the sailor who understood what needed to be done, while senior men failed. Perhaps that is close to exactly what happened. Perhaps 6 decades sharpened the picture. The safest conclusion is not to invent a saint. We do not need one. Musgrave may have been an effective leader. Raynal was clearly an unusually resourceful man. Holding may have seen critical problems earlier than the officers. Dalgarno may genuinely have collapsed under the weight of disaster. None of those possibilities cancels the physical facts. One ship remained available. The other disappeared. One group arrived in summer, the other at the edge of winter. One landed inside a protected harbor, the other beneath exposed cliffs. One began with 5 men, the other with 19 hungry mouths. That is why the old title of civilization against savagery is so satisfying and so misleading. It suggests that the island simply revealed what kind of men these sailors really were. The reality is more uncomfortable. The island changed the price of every human virtue. Discipline is easier when breakfast exists. Generosity is easier when there is enough food to share. Patience is easier when you slept under a roof. Leadership is easier when an order can actually be carried out. Cooperation is easier when the group is small enough for everyone to see what everyone else is doing. Take those supports away, one by one, and the same person may begin making very different decisions. That does not mean circumstances control everything. The Grafton men still had to use what they received. A ship full of materials does not automatically become a house. Iron does not automatically become tools. A boat does not automatically cross hundreds of miles of Southern Ocean. The 5 earned their survival. The point is that they had something with which to earn it. The Invercauld survivors made serious mistakes. They delayed movement, failed to organize effectively, and allowed the group to fragment. The point is that those mistakes occurred inside conditions that punished every delay much faster. That is why these 2 shipwrecks remain so disturbing when placed side by side. We like explaining survivors through character. Smart, strong, disciplined, resourceful. We quietly explain the dead with opposite words. Weak, disorganized, selfish, foolish. It makes the world feel controllable. If the right kind of person survives, then all we have to do is become that kind of person. Auckland Island offers a less comfortable possibility. Sometimes one ship stays on the rocks. Sometimes another ship disappears. Sometimes you arrive in January. Sometimes you arrive in May. Sometimes there is a box of tools behind you. Sometimes there is a 100-meter cliff in front of you. Only after those cards have been dealt does character begin to play. The 5 men of the Grafton really did something extraordinary. They turned wreckage into a house, a forge, a school, a set of laws, and eventually a boat capable of carrying them back toward civilization. They deserve every bit of credit for that. The Invercauld survivors also reveal something extraordinary, only darker. They show how quickly a functioning hierarchy can become useless when the physical world that supported it disappears. They show how numbers can become a burden, how delayed decisions become permanent losses, and how badly a group can fracture under hunger. And the final irony is that the difference between the 2 camps was never as complete as the legend suggests. The Grafton men argued. Their leader nearly lost hope. Their first escape plan failed. 2 of them ended up eating mice and wanting to live apart. The Invercauld survivors, once reduced to 3, finally built a boat, moved, hunted, and worked together. One group did not contain civilization while the other contained savagery. Both contained ordinary men.